With Pete Carroll meeting with the media at the NFL annual meetings, he didn't waste much time squashing the rumors about Jamal Adams potentially being out of Seattle after the signing of Julian Love. In fact, he expects to get 3 or 4 safeties on the field together. How is he going to get that done? Rob Rang and I are going to be diving in with some chalk talk on our latest edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad as always to be joined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, for our Wednesday episode. And a special thanks to all the 12s, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen. We're not the way, so we're going to wrap up our pre-draft festivities. We're going to kick off our in-depth draft primers today with the receiver position. So we'll be looking at first-round prospects, day 2 prospects, and, of course, the day 3 gems. Rob's favorite episodes of the entire year as we dive into a bunch of different prospects that could be potential fits for the Seahawks. We'll tackle your questions in our weekly mailbag and much more. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. When the Seahawks made the surprising addition of Julian Love in free agency on a 2-year, $12 million deal, speculation ran rampant about Jamal Adams' future with the Seahawks coming off a season in which he only played in 1 game before suffering a torn quad tendon and undergoing surgery. There's been a lot of questions about his future with the franchise, but Pete Carroll made sure to squash that speculation yesterday during his press conference at the NFL annual meetings in Arizona, quickly making it known that Love's addition doesn't mean that Jamal Adams is on the way out. In fact, they're still looking for ways to get 3 safeties on the field at once. Looking at a quote from Carroll yesterday in Arizona, I know there's some conversation about what we did with Julian. Does that have some impact on Jamal or Quandre? It doesn't. We have a clear thought of what we're going to do with our guys and how we want to play them, and we feel very fortunate to have all of our guys. Obviously, the safety position, Rob, is incredibly important in Seattle's defense. There's a reason that they have always paid elite talents big money at that position. The Seahawks clearly value it more than what a lot of teams do in the NFL. And in terms of top to bottom of the depth chart, with Julian Love now coming into the fold, Ryan Neal being back on a tender, Adams hopefully coming back healthy, and Quandre Diggs coming off his 3rd Pro Bowl. This is as deep and talented of a safety group as you're going to find in the NFL if you can just keep everybody healthy. That has been the issue for the Seahawks. Assuming that all these players are healthy, Pete Carroll yesterday said that they're going to be playing a lot more than 25% of the snaps together, at least Love, Diggs, and Adams. The big question is, how do you accomplish that when you're trying to get so many defensive backs on the field at once? It gives you a lot of flexibility, but it also can be a problem as a defensive coordinator trying to put all those pieces together.
Well, I think that it can, but at the same time, I think that if you just look at today's modern NFL, Corbin, and how do you defend all of these explosive offenses? Well, most of them have multiple wide receivers. And so I think that we're seeing that transition just happen naturally, just the evolution of the game, that you're going to see those slower off-ball linebackers, those run stuffers. They're not going to be on the field quite as much. You're going to see that extra defensive back. And so I think that Seattle and a lot of NFL clubs are going to be trying to make that transition. I just, to your point, think that the Seahawks are in much better position to actually make that switch than just about any other club out there. Just because, again, they do have that very talented and very deep safety room, and Jamal Adams being the linchpin of the whole bunch, because he is the guy that can play back in space. At least I believe that he can do that. I've seen him do that at times, and he is such an impact weapon closer to the line of scrimmage. And so to me, I just think that this is going to be a relatively easy transition for the Seahawks. And I think that really what this is going to come down to is just creating that money safety position. Some people call it a cash position. Some people call it the money linebacker and money safety. There's all kinds of different names you can create for it. But really, all it is it's a safety linebacker hybrid. And it's something that Jamal Adams, frankly, was born to play.
Yeah, it's what the Seahawks were trying to do last year. Jamal Adams was playing a lot at a linebacker type spot in training camp in their nickel and dime sets. They had Josh Jones actually playing as the extra safety instead of Ryan Neal because Neal was banged up for most of training camp. And so that was the expectation going into the year. We're going to play a lot of 3 safety sets where Jamal Adams is going to be able to accentuate his strengths in the box, playing up like a linebacker. And as you mentioned, some call it the money linebacker position, some call it money safety. It's been called the star position by some college programs as well, kind of that do-it-all, jack-of-all-trades safety. And that's what the Seahawks thought they were getting with Jamal Adams. And I think it's time for us just to look at some ways that they can get a money linebacker on the field because there are a lot of different ways, especially with the personnel groupings that they have right now, especially in pass rushing situations. There are a lot of different formations if you have all these guys healthy that you can deploy. The first one that I want to go over, this is the one that our listeners were asking. We have a mailbag segment coming up. Several of you asked about the Bear defense. We're not going to answer any questions on that because, well, that's a big part of this segment right here. But the Bear front, you've got your nose tackle. You've got 2 defensive ends that are playing a little bit tighter alignment. You've got 2 overhang linebackers. The Seahawks have done this a lot the last 3 or 4 years. And I expect that this is still going to be a staple for their defense. And this allows you to get Julian Love on the field as the nickelback, or you could have Ryan Neal out there if you wanted, maybe Kobe Bryant, who was their slot last season. But this is just one way that they can get 3 of those safeties on the field and still be playing pretty heavy up front. I would assume that Boye Mafe is going to be playing that other outside linebacker spot across from Uchenna Nwosu most often in this set because of his edge defense that he showed off in his rookie season. But that allows you to have more of a run-stopping look while still getting 3 of those players on the field together. And I think that's going to be important. They're going to need to find ways that they can do that so they're not just relying on 3 and 4 safety sets in pass obvious situations. Take advantage of guys like Adams that are good run defenders.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that Bear front, that those of you who are watching this on YouTube were able to see that. Corbin had kind of lined this up. Those of you who are just listening, though, the Bear front, again, is going to be basically 5 defensive linemen, or 3 true defensive linemen, 2 linebackers on the outside. So you're going to have 5 men in the line of scrimmage. You're going to have the 1 free roaming linebacker. In this case, we are projecting that to be, of course, Bobby Wagner as kind of being that vacuum in the middle to just kind of eat up all of those tackle opportunities. And then again, though, having those 5 defensive backs behind them. And so that's, I think, could wind up almost being Seattle's base defense at this point, just because, again, you play in a division, that was going to be one that you'd have 2 offenses in the Rams and the Cardinals that were going to throw the football around a lot. That's not likely going to be quite the case quite as much in Arizona now with the new system being in place there. But at the same time, you still have to be able to stop the run. And so I love this Bear front, again, as the possible base package. But Corbin, I know that, you got a lot of other ways to kind of show the way that Seattle should be able to implement these 3 safety looks, especially when teams start to, populate the field with more wide receivers.
As you mentioned, that is what the league is trending towards. Now, we saw more emphasis on the run game last year. I do think that it's going to start cycling back that direction a little bit, but in today's NFL, you better be able to defend the pass, and so you got to get as many of those versatile defensive backs in the field as you can, and there's a lot of ways that you can do that maybe aren't quite as good against the run. And one way that intrigues me a little bit is a nickel package with a 3-man front. You don't see a lot of teams running this, but Seattle's personnel actually fits pretty well right now. You could put Draymond Jones in as your 1 tech, and then you can have Darrell Taylor and Uchenna Nwosu as your defensive ends. And then you could have your money linebacker in Jamal Adams. And your third linebacker on the field, it could be Devin Bush. Maybe you end up having somebody like Darrell Taylor there so that you can have a fourth pass rusher off the edge. There's a lot of different things that you can do. And again, this is a 5 defensive back set. It's a nickel package. So Julian Love is on the field. And in this case, you can get Ryan Neal out there as well because those 3 linebackers, one of them is going to be Jamal Adams. So this is actually a way to get 4 safeties on the field and maximize the snaps for all of those really talented players that you have on your defense. And that's not the only way that they can get 4 defensive backs on the field either. There's also the dime package with 6 defensive backs that allows you to do that in a more traditional sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the fact that you just kind of showed this nickel alignment because I think that this is one, again, that you have to really consider when you're going up against teams like, say, again, the San Francisco 49ers that maybe will line up in more of a kind of a traditional offense, like just a straight up I formation kind of stuff. But you have to account for the George Kittle factor and just what a dynamic weapon that he is. And then with a guy like a Kyle Juszczyk as well, it's something that when you have that nickel alignment, you are going to be very vulnerable to running plays. So you're going to have to be able to have some safeties who are willing to hit you. You're going to have the linebackers who are willing to hit you. And so I do think that is something that, again, Seattle, because they have such a unique depth and variety, a different style of play at the safety position. You got a super instinctive player in Quandre Diggs, for example. Then you get such a long, not that Ryan Neal isn't instinctive, but he's just so darn long, and that's one of the things that makes him such a unique player, in comparison. So again, to me, that is why that this alignment, I think, again, makes a lot of sense for the Seahawks.
One last alignment real quick that I do want to make sure to mention, because I think with Bobby Wagner coming back, we are going to see the Seahawks in obvious pass situations. I expect in order to take some of the load off of him and allow him to stay on the field, that we are going to see what the Seahawks call their bandit package, which is actually 7 defensive backs on the field. This is how you get Kobe Bryant out there too. But Bobby Wagner can be a 4th pass rusher in this instance. We saw him get 6 sacks and 20 quarterback pressures last year. So you can have him playing as a defensive lineman, so to speak, that's standing up, sugaring A gaps and moving him around, letting him blitz. And then you can have Jamal Adams, maybe Julian Love or Ryan Neal playing your 2 zones in the middle. And you're going to be much more athletic there than at this stage what Bobby Wagner is going to give you in coverage. And so there are a lot of different ways that the Seahawks can get 3, even 4 safeties on the field. The big caveat here, you got to keep everybody healthy. But if you can see why Pete Carroll keeps going back to this vision, because that would be the Seahawks' best defense. If they can get 3 or 4 of those players out there together, that's going to give them so much flexibility against opposing offenses. And so it's been tantalizing. We haven't gotten to see it on the field. Maybe in 2023, and finally we get to see all these guys stay on the field together, and it could end up being a really special group on defense for the Seahawks. Coming up next, we're going to answer your questions in our weekly mailbag segment. Don't go away. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. The NCAA tournament is officially in Final Four mode, and there's no better place to get in the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. Again, that's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and sign up today to claim your no-sweat first bet. Then you can wager on everything from the money line to point spreads to which team will be cutting down the nets, whether it's a blue blood like UConn or a Cinderella like Florida Atlantic or San Diego State, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So don't miss your shot at a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad as always to be joined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks, as always, to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in Idaho, Massachusetts, or across the ocean in China. We greatly appreciate you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. It's time for our weekly mailbag segment. We've been kind of putting in the middle of the week on Wednesday. That's when it's been falling. We got tons of great questions from you, our valued listeners. So, Rob, we got the first one here coming from Alex Hernandez tweeting, if Seattle drafts a tight end in the upcoming draft, Do you see them moving on from any of the current tight ends already on the roster before the season starts? An interesting question because they do have some players that are nearing the end of their contract, and they have another one that's had some injury issues.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really why I think makes it a fascinating decision for Seattle, because as we've talked about so many times, Corbin, this is a really good tight end class. And as you just mentioned, or at least alluded to, with Kobe Parkinson and Noah Fant both entering the final years of their contract, Will Dissly his deal is a little bit longer, but of course he's had all the injury problems that he has had. It would seem to make some sense to take a tight end, but over the last several years, Seattle has kept only 3 tight ends on their roster heading into the season. So if you are going to invest an early draft pick in one of these tight ends, then you must be planning on getting rid of one of those tight ends. And I just don't know that Seattle is willing to do that. So that, to me, that's what makes this fascinating. If Seattle takes a tight end, I think that it suggests that they're a little bit nervous about Will Dissly's recovery, or I think that they are trying to peddle one of their veteran tight ends, which might make some sense because Seattle's got some really good ones. But at the same time, I think that Seattle has enough other concerns. That's one of the reasons why I'm kind of backpedaling a little bit on the possibility of Seattle taking a tight end. I understand it if they do it. But at the same time, given the players already on their roster, I just don't know that they're going to do that.
Next question here coming from A Foxer1 tweets, after taking a redshirt year due to a hip injury, what are expectations for Tyreek Smith out of the Ohio State University now that he's fully healthy going into 2023? First off, I've got to give him the nod for the Ohio State as one of the enjoying football when playing football. But anyway, this was a player I was really excited about in training camp last year, and I only got to watch him in 2 practices because that's all he was available for. He was dealing with a hip injury and was on the PUP list to open his first camp, then got activated a few weeks in, and he was causing major problems in practice for both of Seattle's rookie tackles. He was dominating them, getting after the quarterback as much as you can in a training camp practice. But you could see the burst, you could see the acceleration that doesn't necessarily show up in his athletic testing. So this was a kid I was getting pretty fired up about, and then he landed on injured reserve, didn't play a single game. So I think he is truly the wild card of this edge rushing group this year. Maybe you could put Alton Robinson in there because he missed all of last year too, but this is a kid the Seahawks remain very high on. John Schneider was very complimentary of him a few weeks ago when asked about his status. So they still view him as a potential piece on this defense. And he was a decent run defender at Ohio State too. So that might help him get some snaps on the field too. He's just got to prove that he's healthy because that hip was a major issue for him that lingered throughout training camp and unfortunately resulted in him not being able to play at all last year. If he's healthy, which it sounds like he is, then he's got a chance to be a player that steps in and takes some significant snaps for the Seahawks, even though he didn't play at all last season. Another question for Rob coming from the Briotas tweets, with Pete and John going at all the top quarterback pro days, do you think they are actually interested in a quarterback this year, or is it all a smokescreen and they were really just paying attention to other players at those respective schools?
I am 100% convinced that they are actually interested in quarterbacks this year. And that is not that I have some secret sources inside the front office or the scouting department that's saying, hey, we're interested in quarterbacks. It's just that the quarterbacks are that good, and it's that unusual of an opportunity here. And I think that you're just facing the reality that as great as Geno Smith was this last season, the expectations were zilch, and now the expectations are very high. If you don't, it's playoff or bust. And Geno Smith, to his credit, he acknowledges that he signed a contract that acknowledges that. And I think that Pete Carroll and John Schneider have been straight up, at least that's what they've claimed, is that they've been, they've told Geno Smith and Drew Lock, hey, that's just, if you resign, that doesn't mean that we're not going to take a quarterback at number 5 or somewhere thereafter. I just look at these quarterbacks and I think that at least the first 2, certainly Bryce Young for Alabama, CJ Stroud from Ohio State, certainly should be off the board. But number 5, if they are on the board at 5, then I think Seattle's going to have so many different people who are going to be looking to trade up. or take them themselves. And Anthony Richardson, to me, is the wild card here. I can understand why somebody would want to take him that high, just because the upside is immense. And then in Will Levis, I also get that, just because, again, I think that he has some pro readiness to him that can be pretty appealing to a team. So, again, I think all of those guys are absolutely candidates. I think the Seattle is doing their due diligence. I think they're having some fun with it. But I do believe that they are very much interested in these quarterbacks. I think that they are likelier to take a defensive lineman. We've talked about Tyree Wilson, Jalen Carter, and certainly Will Anderson. To me, all three of those guys are likelier than any of the quarterbacks. But still, again, I think that the quarterback is absolutely in play for number 5 overall.
Speaking of Will Anderson, that leads right into the next question that was dished to me, and that comes from Duke Worldwide, tweeting, how big of a drop-off do you see from Will Anderson to McDonald or Derek Hall or Jalen Carter to defensive lineman number 2 or 3, maybe a player like Keaton maybe? Well, I wouldn't have Keaton that high on my list, but I will say this. I think from a talent perspective that Jalen Carter, if he's got his head on straight, is head and shoulders above all of the other potential pass rushing defensive tackles in this class, because he can also stuff the run. He can play all over the line of scrimmage. He can play 4-3, 3-4. It doesn't matter. That's why he was getting top 3 pick buzz until these couple issues in the offseason cropped up as red flags for some teams. And so if he's still on Seattle's board, I think that he is clearly, from a talent perspective, head and shoulders above everybody else. And I think the cream of the crop with the pass rushers is Will Anderson as well, because he's got that great first step. He had 17.5 sacks for Alabama 2 years ago. So clearly he knows how to get after the quarterback. I think what sets him apart, though, is he's also a very good run defender. He's just a damn good football player all around. And some of the other names that were just mentioned there, while they're good football players, and Seattle would love to have a player like McDonald in the second round maybe, he's not going to be a guy that you can move around the way that you can move Will Anderson around. He's going to defend the run that way. They're just not on the same playing field. Now, from pass rushing standpoint, you could maybe make an argument. McDonald's got more burst off the edge. He might be a guy that's going to be better in a pass rushing situation overall. But I think from a complete package standpoint, Will Anderson Jr. and Jalen Carter, there's a reason that those guys have been in the top 3, top 5 this entire pre-draft time, really since last draft happened, because they are dynamic talents at their positions. And there's a reason why they get that much publicity compared to the rest of the players at their position. Next question for Rob, coming from Savage Cookie tweets, what do the Seahawks and their coaching staff, as well as players, have to do to improve tackling? This was a major problem for a good chunk of last season, and yet it feels like it might be kind of a complicated issue to tackle, literally, here.
It is. It is a difficult issue. That's the thing, is that the NFLPA, rules that are in place that they, signed with the league, have basically restricted coaches, and they have very few opportunities to have live contact, and, tackling is contact. And so it's a little bit difficult. I kind of compare it to what we're seeing in basketball. It's March Madness, of course, and you see some unbelievably athletic players. Then you see guys can't hit a free throw, and to me, that's what we're seeing here with the NFL. Is we're seeing this kind of loss of the technique, the loss of the fundamentals over just pure athletes, guys who are just so unbelievably athletic that they can make plays that they don't have any technique whatsoever. And I think that's just that's all the highlight reel kind of stuff that you see now. And that's what kids are doing. And again, I think that at the NFL level, it's certainly an issue. But again, I think that a big part of that is because the league and the coaches are put in a difficult position for player safety, and I understand that. But even at the lower levels, the college, the high school, the junior levels, I think that we have to see a better focus on really seeing what you hit, going through your hips, wrapping up cleanly, all those things, keeping the head out, all those things that everybody who has played the game or coached the game at all knows should be the way that you teach fundamentals and tackling. Just we're not seeing that very much at the NFL level, whether it be the Seahawks or anybody else.
Yeah, and really that emphasis hasn't been there enough, I don't think, at the lower levels, as you mentioned, either. So it's an issue that you're battling because you're trying to find a balance point between limiting contact away from games and making sure that players are able to tackle correctly and avoid injuries that way. So you, again, I think it's a really difficult dilemma, and the NFL is certainly dealing with it as well with the way that the rules are now set up. Chase Rydell tweets, does Zeke Elliott make sense as a running mate with K9 now? I'm going to straight up say no. From a talent perspective, Zeke Elliott can still play. I think that he can still come in and run the football for you, and he's a really good pass protector. Everybody in Dallas has been talking about the teammate that he is, so I don't think it would be an issue bringing him into your locker room either. But the price and the fact that there's just so many good running backs in this class, I don't see a point in wasting money that the Seahawks, quite frankly, right now don't have anyway on a player who is on a decline, and there's a reason the Dallas Cowboys moved on from him. I think he's still an effective football player, and he would help the Seahawks, but I don't think you're going to get your bang for your buck. If he's a guy that ends up signing for near veteran minimum because nobody will sign him at that point, then you can reopen the discussion. But I would expect he's going to end up getting paid a little bit more than that. I would rather get somebody that's going to be under club control for 4 seasons. Coming up next, we're going to switch gears to the NFL draft. It's less than a month away. Oh, it's going to be here before you know it, Rob, and we're going to have the 3-day festivities in Kansas City. So we're going to kick off some in-depth primers looking at day 1, day 2, and day 3 prospects at the receiver position who may stand out as potential targets for the Seahawks. So let's get to that here on our Wednesday edition. Rob, the receiver position, we know DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Those 2 players have been perennial 1,000-yard receivers the last couple of years. They score a lot of touchdowns. They're 2 of the best receivers in the game, and yet they continue to struggle in Seattle to find that consistent number 3 wideout. D. Eskridge has not been that guy. He's been injured. Jerick Young flashed late last year as a 7th-round pick, but there's no guarantee that he's going to make that leap forward. Marquise Goodwin is now with the Cleveland Browns, so he's no longer in town. It's just been an issue. And so this does feel like a position that is a bigger need than what maybe some fans would like to admit.
I 100% agree with you on that. I think that it is a very good chance that Seattle could wind up taking a wide receiver with one of those very first 4 selections. I think that there's a good chance number 20 overall, because there might be 1 receiver off the board at that point, maybe even 2. But I really think that the sweet spot in this draft class for wide receivers is going to be in that late portion of the first round, all the way through the second. And again, Seattle having 3 draft picks there, I wouldn't be surprised at all if they take advantage of that. So let's just jump right into it. So I'm going to mention 2 wide receivers. There's, I think could be 3 or 4 of them that wind up going in the first round. I have 2 receivers I think that could be in play for Seattle at number 20 overall, as well as 2 other receivers I'm going to mention for the second round or second day, and a couple other guys for the late rounds as well. For me, real quick, my top tier wide receivers, I'm going to go with Jalen Hyatt from Tennessee and Jackson Smith-Njigba from Ohio State. Now, these are 2 completely different wide receivers. Jackson Smith-Njigba, everybody talks about him. He is, in the opinion of some, the number 1 receiver in this draft class. And I understand why. His size, his physicality, he is better in the slot. He catches just absolutely everything that's thrown his way. He's got the body control. I have used the comparison to Keenan Allen for a long time. That's an all-pro kind of a player. I love Jackson Smith-Njigba. I think he could be an absolute superstar in Seattle or elsewhere. Jalen Hyatt is the speed demon. He is the guy that you'd be taking advantage a little bit more, in my opinion, of Geno Smith's ability to throw the ball over the top. I think Jalen Hyatt also has a little bit of, after the catch to him in a different type of a way. He's not going to bounce off of a would-be tackler, but he can absolutely make somebody miss and be gone. Whereas Jackson Smith-Njigba, again, doesn't have that breakaway ability. Hyatt is the Blitnikoff Award winner. He scored 15 touchdowns against SEC competition a year ago. Jackson Smith-Njigba scored a total of 10 touchdowns in his Ohio State career and missed most of last season with a hamstring injury. I still think both of them are absolute superstars. If either one of them was Seattle selection number 20, I think that both of them will go on to have very, very successful careers.
Two other names that I think at pick 20 would make sense, and maybe even with a trade down from number 5 in the case of a player like Quentin Johnston from TCU. We saw them go all the way to the national title game. Now, we won't talk about what happened in the title game, but before that point, Johnston was dynamic and had a huge touchdown against Michigan in the first game of the college football playoffs, over 1,000 receiving yards, 6'3", around 210 pounds. Had a 40-plus inch vertical at the combine. Didn't run the 40, but you can see the speed on game tape. And so can you imagine putting him and DK Metcalf on the same roster with Tyler Lockett sandwiched between them? And teams are going to be having to deal with those two size speed demons on the outside. I see some similarities in the way those two play the game, because Johnston's a guy that hasn't necessarily always been consistent winning jump balls, but he's gotten better throughout his college career, and that ability to just create separation. Seahawks under Pete Carroll, they love speed. And then you got Jordan Addison, who didn't run quite as fast as I thought he was going to at the combine, but still a 4.49, more than respectable enough for a guy that moves a little faster than that on game tape. And just such a silky smooth route runner, reliable hands, can win at all levels of the field. Ball tracking is inconsistent at times, but still, you look at the numbers he put up at Pittsburgh before he transferred to USC, and he's not a guy that's going to break a lot of tackles, but he makes people miss, and he creates separation because of how quick he is in and out of his breaks. So he makes a lot of yards after the catch. Both these guys would be first-round prospects in my mind that would make sense for Seattle. I actually see a little bit of Tyler Lockett's game in Jordan Addison. So both of Seattle's receivers, you can see some in those two players who I think will be gone at some point in the first round. Now, let's get to the meat of the draft for receivers, as you mentioned, and that's day 2. I don't think this is as good of a receiver class as we've seen in recent years. It's still a really solid one, though, and there's plenty of talent in the second round. And I know there's one player in particular from the Senior Bowl that's a little bit on the smaller side, but Seattle's never had an issue with small receivers if they can play, that you think might make some sense for the Seahawks on day 2.
Well, it's funny, when you hear the name Tank Dell, it's easy to imagine a bigger guy. I mean, the name is Tank, and this guy is like, 5'8", 160 pounds. I mean, he is just tiny, 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 but he is lightning quick. I mean, he scored, I believe it was 17 touchdowns this past season, and that's just in 1 year. I mean, this isn't Madden we're talking about. This is major college football at Houston. This guy is absolutely dynamic. You mentioned the Senior Bowl, Corbin. I mean, his stop-start ability, his change of direction was just uncoverable at the Senior Bowl. And again, I kind of go back to Geno Smith and his accuracy. I think that you have a receiver who can get open the way that this kid can get open with knowing that he's going to be going up against one-on-one coverage, because obviously, again, as you mentioned, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett on the outside. I think that it really could be a dynamic weapon. And the Seahawks are clearly thinking the same thing. That's why they made the investment in D. Eskridge a couple of years ago. I still think that D. Eskridge could be this type of a player. But the reality is that he has not been this type of a player yet. So I'm going to switch from Tank Dell, again, an absolutely dynamic, but a mighty might kind of a player, to a guy who's not a lot bigger than Tyler Scott. I mean, he's 5'11", 185 pounds, but still, this is a 4'4" guy as well. This is a guy who's a little bit more raw. Both of these receivers, that's the reason why they're available on day 2, is that neither one of them catches the ball as cleanly as the receivers I talked about earlier. There's a lot of drops that you're going to see with both of these receivers, especially with Tank Dell. Tyler Scott is a guy that played some running back a little bit, kind of like a D. Eskridge, had some running back in his background. Didn't have the cornerback, I don't believe, but he was a junior Olympian in high school. This is a guy who's a fantastic track athlete. Obviously, we saw what Cincinnati was able to do a couple of years ago and becoming the very first, playoff team in major college football history to kind of break through that barrier as a non-Power 5 school. I think, to me, when I look at Tyler Scott, I see a guy who has the competitive fire that I'm looking for. He does have a little bit of that physicality after the catch. He certainly has the speed. And of course, Kobe Bryant is going to know him very well as well, also. And so I think the Seahawks can kind of get into the mind of their young cornerback, who everybody talks about what a pro he is, and ask and see if Tyler Scott is that kind of a player. If he is, I think that he should be one of those receivers on Seattle's short list on day 2 as well.
Something that really jumps out with this draft class, you just talked about 2 receivers that are on the smaller end. When we talked about Zay Flowers, another first-round prospect, he's on the smaller end. There's a lot of receivers that are in that 5'10" to 175, 180-pound range that are in the upper echelon of this group. There's not a lot of bigger receivers. Another player that you can put in that mold is Josh Downs from North Carolina, but boy, is he explosive. And this is not one of those players that you see spurts where he's really good. This kid had over 100 receptions 2 years ago for North Carolina and almost got there last year as a first-team All-ACC selection. He's got punt return experience. He's lightning in a bottle. He's one of those players, you just get the ball in his hands and you let him go to work. And he was able to rack up more than 1,300 receiving yards 2 years ago. So, I mean, this is a guy that's explosive. He can win downfield. He's better in the intermediate than some of the other smaller receivers in his draft class. And so Downs is actually a player that I could see sneaking into the back half of the first round, depending how the other players we mentioned end up getting selected. If there's a run in the teens, early 20s, Downs could be a player that somebody moves up to get because they're worried they're not going to be able to wait till the second round to get him. So he's one of those fringe candidates that is really explosive that I like in this draft class. And let's talk about one receiver that is a little bit bigger. Now, he didn't measure quite as big as I thought he would at the Senior Bowl, but still, Rashee Rice from SMU is 6'1", over 200 pounds. So compared to the other guys we've been talking about, he's a giant. So he's a good-sized receiver that can win downfield. He creates yards after the catch in bunches. One of the best yak-producing receivers in all of college football last year for the Mustangs. There are some consistency issues in terms of drops, focus drops most of the time. His intermediate game is going to need a little bit more attention, but he can win downfield. He can win contested catches, extremely productive, and another receiver that's got some good size that can create after the catch. And so I think on day 2, second round, he would be a player, especially with the Seahawks loving the Senior Bowl. He showed out in Mobile. So I see him as a player that would make sense. Real quick, let's get to those day 3 gems, because these are the players that John Schneider's always looking to unearth on day 3. They've picked some good receivers in later rounds. Who are 2 names that jump out to you, 4th through 7th round, maybe that our listeners aren't as privy to, that could make sense for the Seahawks?
Well, one player that I think that there actually might be some Seahawks fans that might be privy to would be Jalen Marino Cropper from Fresno State. And I say that they might be privy to him because, of course, University of Washington has this head coach, Kalen DeBoer, who's done a fantastic job previously at been at Fresno State. And, their offense was absolutely spectacular. That's why UW was interested in hiring DeBoer in the first place. And Cropper's numbers were unbelievable. And then when DeBoer left, I think a lot of people, myself included, thought, well, let's see if Cropper's numbers go down. Instead, they did not. They just multiplied. And when I watched him on tape, Corbin, I saw a guy who has just electric feet, his quickness in and out of his breaks. And I thought, okay, this might be a sleeper. No one's going to really even know about him. And then he went to the combine and ran a 4.4, and now everybody knows about him. And so to me, he is a guy that's not likely to be available in the 6th or 7th round, but in that 4th, 5th round kind of turn, very similar size as some of the other receivers I mentioned. I think he actually has better hands, just natural hands, than a Tank Dell or a Tyler Scott, who I mentioned before. And I was remiss in forgetting one of my favorite statistics about Tyler Scott: 10 of his 13 career touchdowns going over 30 yards. So again, playmakers. Those are the kind of guys I think that really Seattle needs to look at. Is one of these slot guys. But you make an excellent point about Seattle's lack of size, and I think that that's something that I want to mention with my final receiver I'm going to talk about, that being Michael Wilson from Stanford. 6'1", 216 pounds. He's absolutely spectacular at the Senior Bowl. He has had, to say he's been snake bit with injuries doesn't give enough venom to a snake. I mean, because Michael Wilson has had his struggles with durability, and that's why he is going to wind up falling to the point where he's going to wind up becoming a steal. Because when he is healthy, this is clearly an NFL player. I mean, he just absolutely pops off the tape. I haven't seen a wide receiver pop off the tape for Stanford in a long, long time, but this kid does. And so someone's going to get a steal. He's going to wind up going like 5th, 6th, 7th round. And Michael Wilson is a player. And so he's a guy that I think that, again, Seattle and any other smart team is going to wind up looking very closely at.
My day 3 gems are 2 players that really contrast one another. Charlie Jones, coming from Purdue, started his college career at Iowa, didn't have great statistics, transfers to West Lafayette, and then explodes. 1,300 receiving yards, 12 touchdowns for the Boilermakers last year. Then he goes to the combine, runs a 4.4. And that's not necessarily something on film that you notice. He is very crafty, runs a lot of his routes from the slot. Just a pristine route runner. He knows how to get open. He understands what defenses are doing to him, and he'll surprise you with his ability to create after the catch. Even though he's a 4.4 guy, you don't necessarily see it on the field. He doesn't have the ton of juice. Not a guy that's going to win vertically over the top a lot, but Seattle's got receivers that can do that. What they could use is a receiver that can win in the middle of the field and as an intermediate receiver that can win contested catches in traffic, and Jones does all of those things really well. He is one of my draft crushes watching Purdue's games. Every time I watch Purdue in the Big Ten against some really good defenses, this kid exploded, and you can just see the really good natural route running skills and the savvy. Seattle could use a receiver like that. On the flip side, Pete Carroll is enamored by elite athletes. And Bryce Ford Wheaton from West Virginia, you want to talk about a guy that put on a show, running in the 4.3s, 40-plus inch vertical at the combine. By the way, he's 6'4". He's a big-bodied guy. This is one of those pure size, speed, trait prospects. And yet there are some games that you watch where when his quarterbacks actually could get him the football, he put up big numbers for the Mountaineers. There just wasn't consistency. He did not benefit from having good quarterback play in the Big 12, which is weird saying that because you feel like every team in that conference has great quarterback play. But he did not benefit from that at West Virginia. I think that those traits in the middle of day 3, even though he didn't have the most productive college career, that is the kind of guy that's going to pop off the chart. And there's enough good film of him catching the football, plucking it out of the air with those tools on display in pads that I think the Seahawks would be very enticed to pick him on day 3. So 2 different types of players that could make a lot of sense on day 3. The point is there's a lot of receiver talent. Even if it isn't the best draft class top to bottom that we've seen at the position, it's still a very good one with a lot of options that could make sense for the Seahawks. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and other major podcast platforms for free to make sure that you don't miss a single episode. Coming up on our Thursday show, I'll be joined by Locked On Lions host Matt Derry to break down Evan Brown's game, a little bit more intel on Seattle's new starting center, and much more. Hope you'll be listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Go Hawks.